This is Blake from the Good Food Institute, where he is the business innovation specialist. The Good Food Institute is a nonprofit central to the alternative proteins industry. Blake's role is to harvest the next crop of companies that will lead the charge in the future of food. He will speak to us about successes, but also the biggest challenges currently facing the industry, a topic of interest to many potential entrepreneurs. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. And appreciate the introduction. I will just plant a flag as well and say, the folks who are on this symposium, I mean, even today, the likes of Byrne, people like Ricardo from the Alt Meat Lab, of course, James from Game Changers. We heard from Miyoko. We're going to hear from Greg, Seth at Tofurky, people like Ethan at Beyond. I mean, these are veritable pioneers really in the plant-based meat industry, and to hear as an audience member myself to kind of hear the stories and absorb their knowledge has been really, really useful. I'm excited to share my 2 cents as well on the industry. So as Sam mentioned, GFI, we're an entirely donor-funded nonprofit, and we exist to create essentially a drop-in replacement for the system of industrial animal agriculture, for the system of meat, eggs, and dairy. We focus at GFI on kind of 3 main platforms for doing so. Plants via plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, microbes via fermentation, and then animal cell culture, so actually creating cultivated or cell-based meat, eggs, and dairy. And of course, today I'm going to talk predominantly about plant-based and particularly meat, but also touching on eggs and dairy as well. Now at GFI, we focus a lot on the market in which we're competing. And of course, that is the conventional animal agriculture industry. Now, when we think at GFI about the conventional animal agriculture industry, today that industry produces in the neighborhood of 350 million metric tons of meat on an annual basis. And it's an incredibly large system, right? It's actually, of course, from a planetary perspective, one of our largest systems on Earth. And that amount of biomass, that amount of animal flesh, is remarkable in terms of the output on an annual basis. You know, you can see here, as you might have suspected, it's the rough weight equivalent of producing 1 million VW Beetles worth of weight every single day on an annual basis. And I'm not here to evangelize about the externalities of this system of conventional animal agriculture. We're all aware, there's kind of rich literature and publications as to the externalities of the system. What GFI is focused on is not necessarily to convince people to stop eating meat, eggs, and dairy, but to actually create meat, eggs, and dairy via a different production platform for the purposes of this discussion via plants. And so how do we actually create some, most, or even all of our meat, eggs, and dairy as well via these platforms? Now, fundamental to kind of GFI's theory of change, our reason for being, is to create something that people want, that consumers will gravitate towards. And we really do think there are 3 key kind of parameters, if you will, for which we can optimize. That would be taste, price, and convenience. And if you spend time in the alternative protein industry, you'll hear those 3 kind of issues, that's kind of a triad of sorts for which we're trying to optimize. And in the case of these technologies that we focus on, we try and optimize for those 3 things by thinking about the kind of value chain or the technology stack of each production platform. Of course, here you can see kind of cultivated and fermentation. These are 2 areas that we focus on, and we think about the value chain of those technologies as well. Today, we're just going to talk about plant-based meat and eggs and dairy as well, in the value chains that are required in order to create those products, to create a new infrastructure for making meat. So as it pertains to plant-based meat, there are 3 main aspects of the value chain. There is crop development, there is ingredient optimization, and then there's in-product formulation and manufacturing. I'm just going to touch on 2 of those. And we'll start out with crop development. So there's really a rich story to be told about the problem of finding the right crops to actually turn into meat, eggs, and dairy, to turn into plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, right? And there's really something too, and there is a kind of whole line of inquiry, and there's a lot of commercial opportunity to the ability to really stick a tuning fork up to the plant kingdom, right? There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different plant species, and identifying the right ones to actually turn into plant-based meats, to optimize for plant-based meats. Now, there are really two lines of thinking about how we can do this. One is the pure volume game. And when we think about the volume game, and a perfect example of that is something like soy, right? So this is the Impossible Foods approach. Impossible Foods sources primarily soy as their crop input because soy is produced at a vast scale today, right? It is the main feedstock, certainly in the United States, for industrial animal agriculture. So as a result, soy is readily available in large quantities, and there's an established supply chain in order to actually turn soy into feed for animals, but increasingly for companies like Impossible Foods, turn it directly into meat. At the opposite end of the spectrum would be a plant protein of the sort of lemna or duckweed. Now, lemna is a plant protein. It's an aqueous plant protein. It has high concentrations of a protein called rubisco. And we think it may have really interesting qualities in terms of persuading it to act as a plant-based meat kind of replica of sorts, or an animal-based meat replica, if you will, as well as for formulation into things like egg whites, etc. Now, the question with something like lemna is, how do we actually create a new supply chain for lemna such that we can actually supply large quantities to producers such as Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, etc. And when we think about kind of new crop pipelines, Beyond Meat is a perfect example as well, of course, because they really kind of pioneered the growing supply chain for pea, for yellow pea, which really didn't exist in terms of large-scale production in such a concentrated manner as we're now seeing for companies like Beyond Meat. Now, the other aspect of the plant-based meat value chain, the technology stack that I'll quickly touch on, is end product formulation and manufacturing. Now, when we think about this problem of creating plant-based meats, the core thesis is to create from plant proteins, which are typically globular in nature, to create fibrous proteins, which obviously are how animal proteins are constituted. So how do we go from globular to fibrous proteins? Now, the way that we typically do that is through a machine, through equipment called extrusion. Extrusion has been used in the food processing industry for many decades, and it essentially applies heat and pressure in order to persuade, in this case, plant proteins to act more like animal proteins. It's terrific in terms of the ability to scale up this equipment today, although there are some bottlenecks in terms of the supply that we have of extruders. But we can also look to increasingly novel ways of manufacturing plant-based meats, right? Extruders are great, but they don't get us to the total kind of facsimile, the perfect replication of plant-based meats that we're going for, especially if we're trying to replicate whole muscle cuts of meat, things like steak. So we can look into new technologies, things like shear cell technology. This is coming out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Also things like spinning technology, really interesting story. Spinning technology comes from the kind of fabrics and textiles industry, and is actually a technology that we can potentially apply to plant-based meats, create more fibrous proteins as a result of this technology, and again, get closer to the replication of real animal meat. In terms of a bit of a stretch from a manufacturing standpoint, we could also consider things like 3D printing of plant-based meat. But to go back to the global meat market, right, we're trying to produce, 350 million metric tons of meat on an annual basis. There are certainly questions about the scalability of doing that via something like 3D printing, at least in the near term. It is promising, though. So I'll end with a quick kind of thought experiment, if you will. And I spend a lot of my time at GFI kind of looking at the market in relative kind of market share of different technologies to create meat. And of course, historically, this map which is basically a map of the meat market, a graph of the meat market, has been exclusively conventional meat, right? Meat from animals. Now that is changing. And this is a report, or this is a forecast from the consulting firm Kearney. And this is somewhat of an infamous forecast in the alternative protein space, particularly because it's quite bullish about the expectations of plant-based cultivated meat as opposed to conventional. But I do think it's interesting from the perspective of a thought experiment. So I want us to take two kind of time points. So one is point A, that's 2021, where we're sitting today. That state of the world that we're in, we're basically capturing about 1% of the global meat market with plant-based meat today. That is the level of market penetration. And actually, it's actually probably under 1%. In the United States, we capture between 1 and 2% of the meat market. The implications of that is that we produce about 3 to 5 million metric tons in order to satisfy that 1% of the meat market. Where things get really interesting is when we start to look at this scenario B, basically 2030, as proposed by Kearney. They're suggesting that plant-based meat could potentially capture 18 to 20% of the meat market by 2030, 10 years, 9 years. Now, when we think about the supply chain implications of capturing 20%, 1/5 of the global meat market, the numbers start to get quite staggering. So whereas today, in order to produce, 3 to 5 million metric tons of meat, that requires in the neighborhood of, back of the napkin estimates, somewhere between 100 and 200 large-scale production facilities, large-scale manufacturing facilities for plant-based meat. When we move to 18 to 20% of the meat market, say by 2030, that's going to require in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,000 manufacturing facilities for plant-based meat. If we just, again, kind of finger to the wind, each facility costs $75 million to construct, that is going to require in excess of $100 billion of infrastructure investment alone just to create the manufacturing facilities for plant-based meat to capture 20% of the meat market. So all that's to say is there is an incredible market opportunity for playing in this space. There's a huge opportunity for investors to get in early and invest in the infrastructure of the future meat market. And again, right, as someone who's considering, participating in this industry as a career, right, we're sitting at 1% of the meat market today. It's fairly daunting because conventional meat as it stands still vastly eclipses the production platforms which we think are the future of meat. At the same time, that is 99% market share that we have the ability to potentially play into. So the opportunity to create new companies, to create new supply chains, and to capitalize on the market opportunity to really create a kinder meat production system as well as eggs and dairy. So with that, I'm going to pause. If anyone has questions, happy to answer those. If you're interested in the alt protein space, GFI maintains a community called GF Ideas. Just Google it. It's a community of over 2,000 individuals who are interested in starting companies in this industry. As well, there's a lot of really good work being done on the Berkeley campus around alt protein. So GFI is affiliated with the Berkeley Alt Protein Project. So reach out to them if you'd like to get involved. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Blake. That was fantastic. And GFI's reports are awesome. If any of you haven't checked them out, I follow them myself. And we do have a few questions from the audience. The first one I wanted to start off with, the Good Food Institute has often been seen by the conventional food industry and others as a lobbying group. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so GFI plays a number of different roles in the industry, right? So we have three main programmatic departments. One is our policy team, and we do actively lobby governments, both state and federal, in the United States and elsewhere. So that is a component of our work. But I think if you ask industry players, particularly on the private sector side of things, I mean, really kind of our founding story is one of working with the largest meat companies in the world. And oftentimes what we're seeing now is kind of these massive meat companies, when they're considering coming into this space, when they're considering kind of expanding their protein supply chain into alternatives, GFI is the first place that they'll come. So advocacy is one component of the work that we do, but we also hinge our work on actually working with the large meat companies, as well as focusing on science and technology, so investing in research and development.
Thank you so much for that answer. That was great. And another question we have from the audience, does making plant protein act like animal protein also change its nutritional or health impacts?
Totally. Yeah, so it's a good question in terms of kind of the health implications of plant-based meat. It's unquestionable that the kind of processing techniques, for instance, extrusion, they do impart some, apologies if my internet's dying out here, they do impart some kind of characteristics, nutritional qualities of plant-based meats, right? If you're concentrating textured vegetable protein concentrate or ice, it is kind of not a whole protein source, or excuse me, a whole plant source. But what we see in terms of kind of the health implications of plant-based meat, these products are largely or typically entirely free of cholesterol. No TMAO is present in these products as well. These products, for the most part, aren't your kale salad, but they are almost objectively or unquestionably more healthful than conventional animal counterparts.
Thank you, Blake. And what kinds of founders are currently missing from this space, and how can the industry do better to recruit them to the cause?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, you know, we have a number of different kind of founder profiles in the industry. And what we've seen is kind of traditionally a lot of people who are highly involved in kind of the animal welfare and animal rights space. And that was really the first wave of companies, right? People who realized that, you know, we can focus on the demand side of the equation, but it's also going to be important to create new products. So we have founders who come from kind of the traditional plant-based space. We are also increasingly seeing people come from the biotechnology industry. So actually a lot of the executives now at kind of the cultivated meat companies, as well as the fermentation companies, are increasingly coming from biopharma, the synthetic biology community, and that is massive. We need chemical engineers, we need mechanical engineers to actually create the manufacturing equipment. And then as well, we need food scientists. So these are kind of the three categories that we focus on, but we really are trying to broaden the umbrella of who feels like they can be involved in this industry. So we welcome anyone and everyone to start companies in this space. We think there's plenty of opportunity.
Awesome, thank you. And one question to wrap things up, and building off that question a little bit, because I know we have a lot of founders in this audience and also a lot of people who are interested in this space or becoming founders. Do you have words of wisdom for potential new founders who might be overwhelmed with how much interest there is in this industry and whether they can find their niche?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, for me, if I were planning on starting a company right now, it's a wonderful time to start a company in alternative proteins because there is an abundance of capital. And really, when you look at this industry over the past year, there is in excess, I think I just ran the numbers within the past few days, across the three alternative protein kind of production categories, there is in excess of $2 to $3 billion invested in the industry in 2020 alone. So there's no shortage of capital. But I think founders really do need to focus on kind of the market fit component of this industry. So now you need to create a product that has an additional value proposition aside from just saying, I'm creating another burger, I'm creating another chicken tender, whatever it may be. So there is technologic differentiation that needs to take place in order to capture investment from some of the more competitive investors. But there's also the product market fit, right? So going out to speaking with consumers, because obviously there's just a lack of consumer education certainly in certain parts of the country as well as globally.